A boy selling his family's old dog on the street caught the attention of a millionaire. He paid for it, but a few days later, the boy was seen at an animal shelter with his dog. The sign was old, its edges curling from damp air and rough handling. The letters, written in black marker, wavered with the unevenness of a child's handwriting. "Selling my dog for $500. Need medicine for Mom." The ink had smudged in places, as though someone had gripped the cardboard too tightly, their fingers pressing into the letters as if trying to hold on to the words themselves. Beyond it, the world moved on without pause. A woman haggled over the price of apples, her voice sharp with determination. A vendor called out discounts on leather belts, his tone bordering on desperation. Somewhere, the metallic clang of a cash register signaled a successful sale. The scent of grilled meat and warm bread mingled in the air, carried by the crisp morning breeze. But Carl stood still. His hands, small and rough for a 10-year-old, gripped Max's leash tightly. The dog, a golden retriever once full of life, now sat obediently at his side, ribs faintly visible beneath his thinning coat. His tail barely twitched, as if even that small movement required more energy than he had to give. Carl inhaled, steadying himself. He had promised he wouldn't cry. Not here. Crying never fixed anything. People passed by, their gazes flickering to the sign before darting away, as though the sight of a boy selling his best friend was something they couldn't afford to witness. Some slowed just enough to read the words, their brows creasing in something like pity. But they moved on quickly, their hands tightening around shopping bags, their eyes fixed on some safer distraction. A tall man in a wool coat paused, glancing at Max. Carl's chest tightened with hope, but before he could speak, the man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Poor thing," the man muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he walked away. Carl exhaled, his breath unsteady. He crouched beside Max, running a hand over the dog's ears. "I'm sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't have a choice." Max leaned into the touch, his cloudy brown eyes full of trust, as if unaware of what was happening. Carl swallowed the lump in his throat. The laughter came before the voices, sharp, cutting, the kind meant to be heard. Carl recognized it before he turned. A group of boys, 4 of them, all older, all familiar. He had spent most of his childhood avoiding them, learning which streets to take home from school, which corners to keep his head down in. But here, in the open, there was nowhere to go. "What's this?" One of them snatched the sign from Carl's hands, holding it up with exaggerated curiosity. "Selling this mutt? You should be paying someone to take it." The others laughed. $5, tops," another boy added, nudging Max with his foot. Max flinched, but didn't react otherwise. Carl's fists clenched, but he didn't speak. He had learned early that fighting back only made it worse. But Max had never learned that lesson. A low growl rumbled from the dog's throat. Then, without warning, he barked. Loud, sharp. A sound that cut through the chatter of the market, turning heads. The boys stumbled back. "Jesus, that thing's still got fight in it," one muttered, wiping his palms on his jeans like he'd been touched by something contagious. Carl placed a hand on Max's head, grounding both of them. The boys grumbled insults but backed off, blending back into the crowd, their laughter fading. Across the street, a man in a sleek black luxury car had been watching. Benjamin Saunders leaned against the leather seat, unmoving. The car idled at the red light, the gentle hum of the engine barely audible beneath the distant city sounds. He had finished work late the night before. Another exhausting day of meetings, negotiations, and polite conversations laced with false charm. The life of a man who had everything: wealth, power, reputation, but came home to nothing. His evenings were spent in silence, in a penthouse too large for one person, with meals prepared by a chef he rarely spoke to. There was no warmth in his home, just expensive furniture and city lights stretching far beyond his windows. But today, something pulled his attention away from the monotony of routine. Through the tinted glass, he saw the dog first. A golden retriever, thin but still strong, its bark cutting through the chatter of the market. Then, the boy, small, tired-looking, standing with his shoulders tense, fists clenched at his sides. Benjamin's fingers curled around the steering wheel. That bark, that dog. It was impossible. Yet, as he watched, his chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. The retriever's posture, the way it protected the boy, the flicker of something familiar in its dark, intelligent eyes. His lips parted, voice barely above a whisper. Rocky? The name slipped out before he could stop it, and then, as if hearing the name itself, the retriever turned. Its tail wagged once. The light turned green. The car behind him honked impatiently. Benjamin didn't move. The street had settled into a quiet lull. The morning rush had died down, leaving behind only the rhythmic sounds of footsteps against pavement and the occasional murmur of conversation. The flea market stretched beyond the sidewalk, its rows of makeshift stalls a clash of colors and movement. The scent of roasting chestnuts mixed with the sharp tang of car exhaust, weaving through the air in a way that felt both familiar and suffocating. Carl stood stiffly, his small hands clenched around the leash, still trying to process what had just happened. His heart was still hammering from the encounter with the bullies. But now there was something else, something far more unsettling. The man had stepped out of the black luxury car. He was older, probably in his 60s, but carried himself with the weight of someone who had never been ignored in a room. His presence was effortless. Sharp suit, polished shoes, a wristwatch that probably cost more than Carl's entire neighborhood. The way he moved, precise and deliberate, made Carl's stomach twist with unease. Wealthy men didn't stop in places like this. The man didn't speak at first. His eyes weren't even on Carl. Instead, they were locked onto Max. Carl's grip on the leash tightened instinctively, a protective reflex he barely registered. Then Max did something unexpected. The retriever, his Max, who had barked fiercely at the bullies just moments ago, did not growl, did not back away. Instead, his tail gave a slow, tentative wag. His ears perked, and then, with quiet certainty, he moved toward the stranger. Carl's breath caught. Max sniffed the man's hand, then pressed his head lightly against the expensive fabric of the man's trousers. It was not a cautious movement. It was one of recognition. The man's throat moved as he swallowed. He exhaled shakily before kneeling, ignoring the way his expensive suit brushed against the dust of the pavement. "Rocky?" he whispered. Max's reaction was immediate. His tail wagged harder, his body trembling slightly as if overwhelmed by emotion. His eyes, those same warm brown eyes Carl had looked into every day for the past 5 years, shone with something Carl didn't quite understand. Carl took a step back. What was happening? He could feel the knot in his stomach tighten. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation, but nothing made sense. Why was this man calling Max by another name? And why? Why was Max responding? The man, still kneeling, reached out, his fingers brushing against Max's fur as though he were afraid the dog might vanish beneath his touch. Carl's voice came out more defensive than he intended. "What do you want?" The man finally looked up, as if just now remembering Carl was there. His face, which had been unreadable just seconds ago, softened. He reached into his wallet and, without hesitation, pulled out a thick wad of cash. He extended it toward Carl. $1,000, he said simply. "For the dog." Carl's breath hitched. $1,000. That was more than enough for his mother's medicine, more than enough to keep her stable for at least a month, maybe longer if he was careful. But as his fingers instinctively curled around Max's leash, something inside him twisted painfully. He looked down at his dog, his best friend. the one who had been with him when his father died, the one who never left his side when his mother was too weak to get out of bed, the one who made the cold nights in their tiny apartment feel a little less lonely. Carl's grip on the leash tightened. He turned back to Benjamin, his voice hesitant. "What are you going to do with him?" Benjamin looked up, startled by the question. "Excuse me?" Carl's stomach churned. "You're rich," he muttered. "People like you. You buy things because you can. What if you just get bored of him?" His throat felt dry, but he forced the words out. "Do you even know how to take care of a dog?" Benjamin didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered back to Max, something distant and unreadable settling in his expression. He sighed, rubbing his temple before looking Carl in the eye. "I'm not buying him for entertainment," he said quietly. "I lost something a long time ago, and I think I just found it again." Carl hesitated. The money was right there. His mother needed it. But Max needed him. He inhaled sharply, fingers trembling as he began to loosen the leash. His mind screamed at him to stop, to not do this, but what choice did he have? The moment the fabric slipped, Max whined sharply and pulled back. Carl froze. Max clung to him. His body pressed against Carl's legs, his tail tucked, his ears flat. His entire frame trembled, a soft whimper escaping as his head nudged Carl's stomach. He didn't want to go. Carl felt his throat tighten. His vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, trying to shove down the lump rising in his chest. Benjamin watched the exchange carefully. A heavy silence stretched between them before the man finally spoke again, softer this time. "Tell me about him." Carl hesitated. Why did this man care? Why was he still standing here? But when he met the man's gaze, there was no cruelty, no smugness. There was something else, something quiet and unreadable. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, Carl told him. The scent of roasting chestnuts lingered in the crisp morning air, mixing with the distant smell of gasoline and damp pavement. The flea market had quieted, the early rush of bargain hunters now replaced by slow-moving wanderers, sifting through second-hand trinkets and half-priced produce. Carl stood with his shoulders stiff, fingers still curled tightly around Max's leash. The weight of the conversation hung heavy between him and the stranger. He could feel Benjamin's gaze on him, steady, expectant, but not impatient. Max pressed himself against Carl's leg, tail twitching as if sensing the conflict brewing inside his young owner. Carl swallowed hard, then, without looking up, he began to speak. It had been 5 years ago, in a pet store that smelled like sawdust and old newspapers. Carl's father, Arthur, had taken his hand and led him past rows of eager puppies, ones with silky fur and bright eyes, jumping at the glass dividers, desperate for attention. But Arthur had walked past them all, pausing at the very last kennel. Inside was a scruffy golden retriever, not young, not small. His fur was a little uneven, his ears slightly tattered at the edges, and he had the weary look of an animal that had been left behind too many times. Carl had barely glanced at him before his father crouched down, tapping the glass gently. The retriever lifted his head and blinked, slow and patient, as if he had already made peace with whatever fate had in store for him. "This one," Arthur had said. Carl had been confused. "But he's old," he had whispered. Arthur had ruffled Carl's hair, smiling in that quiet, knowing way of his. Sometimes, the best things are the ones nobody else wants. And just like that, Max became family. "He was my dad's dog first," Carl murmured, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the distant hum of the city. "I mean, he picked him out. But Max, he was always mine." Benjamin hadn't moved. He was still crouched beside Max, his fingers brushing absently through the retriever's fur, his expression unreadable. Carl exhaled slowly, staring down at his shoes. "Me and Max, we did everything together. We played in the park. We'd run through the sprinklers in the summer, and in the winter he'd sleep next to me because it got too cold in our apartment. A small, almost reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Carl's mouth. He could still remember the way Max would curl up beside him, his big warm body radiating enough heat to make the freezing nights bearable. But then, my dad died. The words were softer now, as if saying them aloud would make them heavier. Benjamin's jaw tensed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Carl's fingers twisted the leash in his hands. It was an accident. At least, that's what they told us. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. My mum, she wasn't the same after that, Carl continued. His voice was steady, but there was something fragile beneath it, something that wavered at the edges. She tried, I think. But some days she'd just sit in the dark, not saying anything. Other days, she'd barely get out of bed. His shoulders lifted slightly, then dropped, and then she got sick. Carl had spent too many nights listening to her cough through the thin apartment walls, her body racked with exhaustion. He had seen the stacks of unopened bills, the way she avoided looking at him when he asked what was wrong. She always said everything was fine, but I knew it wasn't. His hands clenched tighter around the leash. One day, I heard her on the phone. She was crying. She said she didn't know how she was going to pay for the medicine. And that was when Carl had made his decision. Selling Max was never something he had considered before, not really. But after that night, he had started watching the way people treated their dogs at the market, noticing how much they were willing to pay for a purebred, for a puppy with the right color, the right size. Max wasn't purebred. He wasn't small or new or particularly special in the way people seemed to care about, but he was good, and maybe, just maybe, someone would see that. Carl's throat felt tight. He took a shaky breath, lifting his gaze to Benjamin. I didn't want to do it, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't have a choice. He expected pity. That was always the look people gave when they heard his story. The slightly tilted head, the downturned mouth, the hollow words of sympathy that meant nothing. But when Carl finally met Benjamin's eyes, he didn't see pity. He saw something far heavier. Benjamin looked devastated. For a moment, he didn't speak. He didn't move. It was as if something had cracked inside him, something Carl couldn't quite understand. Max, sensing the shift, pressed his head into Benjamin's chest, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. Benjamin exhaled sharply, as if trying to steady himself. His fingers curled into the retriever's fur, holding onto it like an anchor. Then, finally, he spoke. No one should have to make that kind of choice. His voice was quiet, but there was a weight to it, a certainty that made Carl's stomach twist in a way he didn't understand. A beat of silence passed between them, thick and charged. Then Benjamin straightened, slipping his wallet back into his coat. Keep the money, he said, and keep your dog. Carl's breath caught. What? Benjamin looked at him, gaze unwavering. I'm not taking him from you. Carl stared, unsure if he had misheard. He had spent the last hour trying to convince himself that selling Max was the right thing to do, that his mother's health mattered more than his own feelings. But now, this man, this complete stranger, was refusing to let him make that sacrifice. Benjamin let out a breath, glancing at Max. I lost him once. I'm not losing him again. Carl blinked, realization dawning. You really think he's your dog? Benjamin's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked at Max, then back at Carl. I know he is. Carl hesitated. His fingers curled against the leash again, though this time not out of fear, out of something else. Trust. Benjamin adjusted the cuff of his expensive jacket, then gave Carl a look so steady it made the boy's chest tighten. Take me to your mother. The city had begun to slow, the late morning haze settling over the streets. The flea market, once alive with shouts and bartering voices, had quieted into a dull murmur. Vendors rearranged their stalls, folding unsold fabrics and packing crates of overripe fruit. The scent of roasting chestnuts mixed with the sharp metallic tang of damp concrete, creating an odd contrast of warmth and decay. Carl shifted on his feet, his grip still firm around Max's leash. The man before him, Benjamin Saunders, stood motionless, his sharp gaze unwavering. The weight of the past hour still lingered between them, thick and unspoken. Carl hesitated. Benjamin had just given him a way out, a chance to keep both Max and the money, a solution Carl had never dared hope for. And yet, he found himself hesitating at the man's next request. Benjamin wanted to meet his mother. Carl's chest tightened. His mother never liked visitors. She barely had the strength to hold a conversation some days, let alone meet a stranger. And this man, this rich, powerful man, who had stepped into their world as if fate had planned it. What did he really want? Carl looked up, cautious. Why? Benjamin didn't seem surprised by the question. His expression softened, but there was something guarded beneath it. I want to meet the people who took care of Rocky, Max, he corrected, glancing at the retriever who sat between them, ears perked. I owe you that much. Carl frowned, his instincts telling him to be careful. But Max hadn't pulled away from this man. Not once. The dog had responded to him in a way that Carl had never seen before. And a part of him, a small, reluctant part, wanted to believe that Benjamin was telling the truth. Still, the idea of leading him home felt strange. Carl bit the inside of his cheek. She's not feeling well. Benjamin nodded, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. I won't stay long. Another hesitation. Then Carl sighed, adjusting the leash in his grip. Fine, but don't say anything weird. A flicker of amusement crossed Benjamin's face. I'll do my best. The walk home was long. Carl led the way through the city's back streets, weaving past boarded-up storefronts and rusted chain-link fences. The deeper they went, the more the streets changed. Sidewalks cracked, litter piled up along curbs, windows covered in graffiti, and old posters advertising businesses that no longer existed. Benjamin remembered he hadn't asked the boy's name. What's your name? I can't just call you Max's master. Carl hesitated when introducing himself to a rich man. The boy looked up at Benjamin and softly replied, Carl. My mother is Lauren. Benjamin Saunders. You can call me Ben if you want. Carl didn't answer, just nodded slightly. Benjamin walked in silence, his polished shoes out of place on the uneven pavement. He didn't ask questions, didn't comment on the state of the neighborhood. But Carl felt his presence behind him, steady and observant. Max trotted beside them, his ears flicking at the occasional stray noise. Finally, they reached Carl's apartment building. The exterior was worn, the bricks stained with years of weather and neglect. The stairs creaked beneath their weight as Carl led Benjamin up to the second floor, past doors with peeling paint and the faint sounds of old televisions humming from inside. At the end of the hall, Carl stopped. He hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door. Inside, the apartment was dim, the curtains drawn against the daylight. The space was small, barely enough for the couch, a worn-out coffee table, and the clutter of medical supplies scattered across the counter. The faint scent of herbal medicine mixed with the mustiness of old furniture. On the couch, Lauren lay curled under a thin blanket. Her face was pale, her breathing slow and uneven. Empty pill bottles lined the small table beside her, next to a half-drunk cup of tea. She didn't stir at the sound of the door opening, her body still beneath the blanket. Carl swallowed, stepping inside. Mom? Lauren's eyelids fluttered. She turned her head slightly, her voice hoarse. Carl? Benjamin stepped inside, his presence filling the tiny space. He took in the room, his sharp eyes scanning everything, the sparse furniture, the unopened envelopes stacked on the counter, the frailty of the woman before him. Carl glanced at him, expecting some kind of reaction, maybe discomfort, maybe pity. But Benjamin's expression didn't change. If anything, his jaw tightened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Benjamin pulled out his phone. He didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He simply stepped away, dialing a number with the same quiet confidence he had carried from the moment Carl met him. Carl watched, unsure what was happening. Lauren, still groggy, blinked in confusion. "Who?" Benjamin's voice was low, firm. "Yes. I need a doctor at this address immediately. No delays." Carl's stomach lurched. "Wait, what are you—" Benjamin lowered his phone, meeting Carl's gaze with a look so steady it made the boy's chest tighten. "She needs real care," he said simply, "and I can help." Carl opened his mouth, a protest rising in his throat, but he hesitated. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? Someone to help. Someone to take away the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders. But it was different now. It was real. And it terrified him. Lauren, still weak, looked between them. Her expression was unreadable, too tired to question, too exhausted to argue. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. Carl swallowed hard. Benjamin slipped his phone back into his coat, his voice quiet but firm. "Help is on the way." The sirens cut through the morning hush, the distant hum of the city momentarily drowned out by the wail of the approaching ambulance. The small apartment, once suffocatingly still, had burst into movement, paramedics sweeping inside, assessing Lauren with calm efficiency. Carl stood frozen near the doorway, Max pressed against his legs, ears pinned back from the unfamiliar sounds. Benjamin, standing a few feet away, watched it all unfold with a detached sort of urgency. He had made the call. He had set everything in motion. But now, as he observed the fragile woman on the stretcher, he felt something tight in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite place. Lauren barely stirred as they lifted her. Her skin, pale against the harsh fluorescent lights, was clammy with fever. She tried to speak, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyelids fluttered before slipping shut again. Carl took an abrupt step forward. "Wait." A paramedic turned toward him. "You're her son?" Carl nodded, his small hands fisting at his sides. The woman's expression softened slightly. "She's stable for now, but she needs to be admitted immediately." Carl's chest felt like it was caving in. This was happening too fast. He had spent weeks, months, watching his mother fade, trying to carry the weight of their world on his small shoulders. And now suddenly everything was moving. He felt a hand on his shoulder, not rough, not forceful, just steady. Carl looked up. Benjamin met his gaze, his grip firm, but not overbearing. "Go with her." His voice was calm, certain. "I'll handle the rest." Carl didn't have time to think, to argue. His mother was being wheeled out, and if he didn't follow, he'd lose sight of her completely. With one last glance at Benjamin, he nodded and ran after the stretcher, Max trotting beside him. The hospital was too bright, too sterile, too cold. Carl sat in the hallway outside the emergency room, his knees drawn up, Max curled tightly at his side. His fingers dug into the dog's fur, gripping the only thing that still felt real. Everything else was a blur. The rush of doctors, the low murmur of nurses speaking in clipped tones, the beeping of machines he didn't understand. Benjamin had been on the phone most of the ride over, speaking in quiet, controlled sentences to people Carl didn't know. When they arrived, money exchanged hands, forms were signed within minutes, and suddenly his mother was being given the care she should have had all along. Carl had never seen someone move through the world so effortlessly, as if there were no barriers in his way. He had no idea what to do with that kind of power. Now, the man sat next to him, silent, his posture relaxed, but his gaze alert. He wasn't fidgeting or scrolling through a phone like most people waiting in hospitals. He just sat. Carl swallowed, shifting slightly. He wasn't used to having company in moments like these. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. "Your mother's in good hands," Benjamin finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "She'll get the best care." Carl nodded, staring down at the scuffed floor tiles. He wanted to believe that. He really did. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then, after a long pause, Carl glanced sideways. "Why are you doing this?" Benjamin exhaled slowly. "Because I can." Carl frowned. "That's not an answer." Benjamin studied him for a moment, then looked away. "It's complicated." Carl scoffed softly, though there was no real bite to it. "Everything's complicated." Benjamin let out a quiet chuckle, the first real sign of warmth Carl had seen from him. He tilted his head slightly. "I meant what I said before. I lost something a long time ago, and today, I think I might have found a piece of it again." Carl hesitated, absorbing the weight behind the words. He didn't fully understand what Benjamin meant, but there was something about the way he said it, something real. Max stirred beside him, lifting his head to rest it on Benjamin's knee. The man didn't react at first. Then, almost hesitantly, he let his fingers skim through the retriever's fur. For a long moment, the three of them just sat there, waiting, breathing, together. The rain started just as they were leaving the hospital. A fine mist at first, then heavier, soaking into the cracked pavement, turning the glow of streetlights into blurred halos. Carl shivered slightly, pulling his jacket closer, his feet dragging as they walked through the parking lot. Max trotted beside him, his fur damp, but his tail wagging as he shook off the water. Benjamin didn't rush him. He simply walked at a steady pace, his umbrella tilted slightly to cover both himself and the boy. He had made his decision long before they left the hospital, but he knew he needed to tread carefully. Carl was wary of him. The boy had accepted his help out of necessity. But trust? That was different. They reached the car, a sleek, dark sedan parked neatly at the curb. Carl hesitated before climbing in, running his fingers through Max's wet fur as if grounding himself. Benjamin shut the umbrella and slid into the driver's seat. The silence in the car was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. Carl stared at his hands, his mind racing. "Where are we going?" he asked finally. Benjamin adjusted the mirror before answering. "Not back to your apartment." Carl's head snapped up. "What?" Benjamin kept his gaze on the road as he pulled out into traffic. "Your mother is going to need proper care when she gets out, and you shouldn't have to stay there alone." Carl frowned. "I can handle it." Benjamin's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, but when he spoke, his tone was even. "You shouldn't have to." Carl turned back toward the window, watching the city blur past. He wasn't sure what to say to that. Benjamin's estate sat on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind tall iron gates and winding roads lined with trees that swayed in the rain. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the long driveway that led to a house too big for one person. Carl's fingers curled against his jeans as he took it all in. The house was old, but well-maintained, its dark brick exterior giving it a sense of quiet grandeur. The windows were tall, warm light spilling from behind heavy curtains. It wasn't just big, it felt empty. Max, tail wagging, perked up as soon as the car rolled to a stop. Carl, on the other hand, stayed frozen in his seat. The sheer size of the place made his stomach churn. He didn't belong here. This wasn't his world. But before he could dwell on it, Benjamin opened the car door for him. "Come on," the man said simply, like this was the most normal thing in the world. Carl hesitated, then unbuckled his seatbelt, stepping out into the chilled evening air. Max jumped down beside him, immediately sniffing the air. His tail wagged faster, and then, without hesitation, he took off toward the house, as if he already knew the way. Carl's breath hitched. He remembers. Benjamin watched as Max trotted up the steps, pausing only to glance back at them expectantly. A faint smile ghosted across the older man's face. He never forgot. Carl swallowed hard, his feet suddenly feeling too heavy. Was this really happening? The inside of the house was just as overwhelming as the outside. High ceilings, dark wooden floors, expensive-looking paintings on the walls. The air smelled like something clean and warm, like a place where nothing ever went bad. Carl stood near the entrance, awkward and out of place, unsure what to do with himself. Max, however, had already made himself at home, sniffing every corner, tail wagging in excitement. Benjamin set his coat down, then gestured toward the kitchen. "You must be starving." Carl hesitated, but didn't argue. His stomach had been empty since morning, and now that the thought of food was in his head, he couldn't ignore it. Minutes later, he sat at the largest dining table he had ever seen, a plate of warm food in front of him. Real food. Not stale bread, not something microwaved in a plastic container, actual steaming, well-cooked food. Carl ate in silence at first, his mind still catching up to the day's events. Benjamin sat across from him, not eating, just watching him carefully, as if waiting for him to say something. Finally, Carl set his fork down. "Why are you doing all this?" Benjamin leaned back slightly. "Because I can." Carl narrowed his eyes. "You said that before." Benjamin's lips quirked slightly. "And it's still true." Carl frowned but didn't push. He was too tired to unravel the mystery that was Benjamin Saunders. After dinner, Carl found himself in a guest room bigger than his entire apartment. The bed looked too perfect to touch, the carpet too soft under his feet. And yet, none of it felt as comforting as the simple act of bathing Max. In the attached bathroom, Carl knelt beside the tub, rolling up his sleeves as he gently poured warm water over Max's fur. The retriever sighed, leaning into the touch, as if the weight of the past few days was washing away with the suds. Carl scrubbed carefully, rinsing out the grime, his movements slow and deliberate. Max deserved this, after everything. Once he was clean, Max shook out his fur, drenching Carl in the process. Carl let out a startled laugh, a real, genuine laugh. Benjamin, passing by the open door, paused at the sound. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there for a moment, watching the way Carl's shoulders had finally relaxed, the way the boy smiled as he buried his face into Max's damp fur. Then quietly, he walked away. That night, Carl curled up in bed, Max stretched out beside him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't cold, he wasn't hungry, he wasn't alone. He closed his eyes, letting out a deep breath. Just before sleep took him, he heard a voice at the door. "You don't have to call me Benjamin," the man said softly. "Ben is fine." Carl, half asleep, murmured, "Okay, Ben." Benjamin exhaled. Then, finally, he turned off the light. The morning light spilled through the tall windows, casting soft golden streaks across the dark wooden floors. The house was silent, save for the distant chirping of birds beyond the estate gates. Benjamin sat at the kitchen counter, his fingers wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee, steam curling in the cool air. Then, his phone buzzed. He answered without hesitation, his voice steady. "She's awake." The words settled in his chest, something unspoken releasing in his shoulders. He turned toward the hallway, where he knew Carl was still asleep upstairs. Max curled up beside him. A few minutes later, Carl was rubbing sleep from his eyes as he stumbled downstairs, still half-dressed in last night's oversized shirt. Max padded behind him, tail wagging lazily. Benjamin set his coffee down. "Your mum's awake." Carl froze. For a brief second, there was silence. Then, suddenly, he was running. The hospital room was quiet when they arrived, but Carl didn't wait. The second he saw Lauren sitting up, he ran straight into her arms. "Mum, I'm here." Lauren gasped softly as Carl buried his face into her shoulder, his small hands gripping the hospital gown, as if afraid she'd disappear. Benjamin stood at the doorway, watching as a mother held her son like she'd never let go again. Lauren sat upright in her hospital bed, her fingers absently stroking Max's fur as he lay beside her. The dull beeping of the monitors blended with the hushed murmurs from the hallway, the sterile scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. It was the first time in days she had felt somewhat present, her mind no longer clouded by fever and exhaustion. Carl was curled up in the chair beside her, fast asleep, his arms wrapped around himself as if bracing against a cold that wasn't there. Even in sleep, he looked tense, his face pressed into the crook of his elbow. The door opened softly, and Benjamin stepped inside. He carried a small bag, the scent of warm food trailing in with him. His movements were unhurried, careful, like a man who didn't belong in hospital rooms, but had learned to navigate them nonetheless. Lauren looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she adjusted the thin blanket draped over her lap. "You again?" Benjamin offered a faint smile, setting the bag down on the small table beside her. "I thought you might prefer something other than hospital food." Lauren studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Max, who had barely lifted his head at Benjamin's arrival. The dog had accepted him too easily, as if he knew him. She shifted slightly, her body weak, but her mind sharper now. "Who are you?" she asked. "Really?" Benjamin pulled up a chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "Benjamin Saunders," he said evenly, "but you can call me Ben." Lauren let out a quiet scoff. "That's not what I meant." Benjamin exhaled, then glanced at Max. His hand reached out, fingers brushing against the retriever's fur, and Max leaned into the touch like it was something familiar. "I was his first owner," Benjamin admitted. Lauren's breath hitched, the words settled between them, heavy and unshakable. For a long moment, Lauren just stared, her fingers tightening slightly in Max's fur. Her throat felt thick. I didn't know," she whispered. Benjamin nodded. "I lost him years ago, thought I'd never see him again." His voice was quiet, but there was something raw beneath it. "Then I found him with you." Lauren looked away, her mind already pulling her back to the past, to Arthur. To the day he had come home with an old, scruffy retriever, his face lit with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. "I know he's not much to look at," Arthur had said, scratching behind Max's ears. "But he's got a good soul." Lauren swallowed hard. Arthur had always been like that, seeing worth in the things others overlooked. She cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. "My husband, Arthur, he brought Max home one day, said he wanted Carl to have a friend." Benjamin listened, his gaze unreadable. "He never told me where he got him," Lauren continued, "just that he felt like he belonged with us." Benjamin nodded slowly, as if the pieces were beginning to fit. Lauren let out a quiet breath. Arthur always had a way of finding things that needed saving. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Then, as if the words had been waiting for their moment, Lauren whispered, "He never drank." Benjamin's head tilted slightly. "What?" She exhaled sharply, looking away. "Arthur, the police report said he was drinking the night of the accident." Her voice wavered. "But he never drank excessively. He barely touched alcohol. And yet, they told me he was drunk. Said that's why he crashed." Benjamin's jaw tensed. "And you believed them?" Lauren laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What else could I do?" She shook her head. "I was grieving. I was alone. And when you're drowning, You don't question the hands that pull you under. Benjamin sat back in his chair, rubbing his fingers together in thought. Lauren inhaled sharply. But it never made sense. The timeline was wrong. He had just gotten off work, and then... She shook her head. Something wasn't right. Benjamin studied her carefully. Then, after a long pause, he made his decision. "If you want the truth," he said, voice steady, "I will find it for you." Lauren's breath caught. Hope flickered in her tired eyes, fragile, hesitant, but real. She nodded, almost reluctantly, as if afraid to believe in the possibility. Benjamin didn't say anything else. He simply stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. That night, as Carl slept beside his mother, Benjamin made several calls to private investigators, old contacts in law enforcement, and lawyers. The hunt for the truth began. The rain started just as Benjamin and Carl left the hospital. A fine mist at first, then heavier, soaking into the cracked pavement, turning the glow of streetlights into blurred halos. Carl shivered slightly, pulling his jacket closer, his feet dragging as they walked through the parking lot. Max trotted beside him, his fur damp, but his tail wagging as he shook off the water. Benjamin didn't rush him. He simply walked at a steady pace, his umbrella tilted slightly to cover both himself and the boy. He had made his decision long before they left the hospital, but he knew he needed to tread carefully. Carl was wary of him. The morning sun stretched golden fingers across the estate grounds, filtering through the tall windows of the house. Outside, the world felt crisp, alive, the kind of day that held promises of warmth despite the lingering chill of the season. Benjamin stood in the kitchen, stirring his coffee, watching as Carl sleepily trudged downstairs, Max padding beside him. The boy was still waking up, his hair a mess, his hoodie too big for his small frame. "You're up early," Benjamin noted, setting down his cup. Carl yawned, rubbing his eyes. Didn't sleep much. Benjamin wasn't surprised. Too many worries for a kid his age. "You need a break." Carl frowned. "From what?" Benjamin leaned against the counter, considering his words carefully. "From everything." He could see the hesitation, the way Carl's fingers curled slightly at his sides. Carl had spent too long carrying the weight of his mother's illness, of survival, of making sure Max was fed even when he wasn't. Benjamin wanted, even if just for a day, to let him be a child again. "There's an animal rescue shelter not far from here," Benjamin continued. "I thought we could go." Carl's frown deepened. "I can't. Mom's alone at the hospital." "She's not alone," Benjamin countered. "The doctors are watching her, and she'd want you to go." Carl didn't argue, but the reluctance was still there. "Ask her," Benjamin said simply. "If she says no, we won't go." Lauren had smiled when Carl asked. It was faint, tired, but genuine. "Go," she had whispered, brushing his hair back like she used to when he was little. "Have fun." So, here they were, a small, quiet animal shelter on the edge of town. The moment they stepped inside, Carl's demeanor shifted. Rows of kennels lined the walls, each occupied by animals of different sizes, some playful, some wary, some simply watching the world pass by with quiet resignation. A group of volunteers bustled around, feeding, cleaning, speaking in soft voices meant to soothe. Carl hesitated at first, unsure where to go, but then a small, scrappy black puppy pawed at the bars of a kennel, letting out a tiny yip. Carl knelt down. The puppy pressed its wet nose to the metal, tail wagging furiously. Without thinking, Carl smiled. Benjamin watched from a few feet away, observing the way Carl's shoulders loosened, how he forgot, for just a little while, the weight he carried. Carl moved from kennel to kennel, meeting old dogs with greying muzzles, playful kittens swatting at each other, a three-legged mutt who greeted him with an unbothered wag of his tail. "You like animals," Benjamin noted, as Carl scratched behind a retriever's ears. Carl shrugged. They don't expect anything from you." Benjamin nodded, understanding far too well what that meant. For nearly an hour, Carl laughed. He played tug-of-war with a puppy, threw a tennis ball for an old German shepherd who still had the heart of a pup, and even helped one of the volunteers fill water bowls. Benjamin let him be. As they were getting ready to leave, Benjamin's phone rang. His posture shifted immediately. Carl, still crouched near a sleeping hound, noticed. Benjamin didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped outside, voice low and measured, as he pressed the phone to his ear. "Go ahead." The investigator's voice was grim. Arthur didn't die in a car accident. Benjamin's expression darkened. The details came in sharp, clipped sentences. A work accident, a cover-up, a company desperate to protect itself from liability. Arthur had been hurt at the construction site, fatally. Instead of taking responsibility, his employers fabricated a lie. They placed him in his car, staged a scene, and let the world believe he was another drunk driver who had taken a wrong turn. Benjamin exhaled slowly, eyes flickering toward the shelter windows. Inside, Carl was still playing, laughing, unaware. How was he supposed to tell him? That evening, Benjamin sat beside Lauren's hospital bed. Carl had gone to get a snack from the vending machine, leaving them alone. Lauren could tell something was wrong before Benjamin even spoke. "Tell me," she said, her voice steady. Benjamin didn't look away. Arthur wasn't drunk. Lauren's breath caught. Benjamin continued, his words precise but gentle. "He died at the construction site. The company covered it up." Silence. Then, suddenly, Lauren swayed. Her hand gripped the bedrail, her breathing uneven. Benjamin reached for her, his voice sharp but calm. "Lauren, breathe." But she couldn't. For years, she had blamed herself, blamed Arthur. She had convinced herself it was his fault, that he had made a mistake, that she had been too blind to see it coming. Now, suddenly, it wasn't true. They had been deceived, and the grief, the rage, was unbearable. Her fingers trembled. They let him die. Benjamin didn't deny it. Lauren sucked in a sharp breath. "And I—" She shook her head, eyes welling with something between fury and heartbreak. "I believed them." The heart monitor spiked. Lauren's breathing turned shallow, her hands clutching at the sheets. Her body trembled, her face draining of color as the weight of Benjamin's words sank into her bones. The beeping of the machines quickened. Benjamin stood immediately, his chair scraping against the hospital floor. "Lauren!" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then suddenly, her body lurched forward. The machines erupted into shrill alarms. The door burst open as nurses rushed in. The room, once quiet, was now chaos. Gloved hands gripping Lauren's arms, a doctor barking orders. The murmur of controlled urgency filled the air as someone reached for an oxygen mask. Carl entered just in time to see his mother collapse against the bed. His world snapped into a blur. "Mom!" His voice cracked. His hands clenched into fists, but his legs felt frozen, too heavy to move. Max whined beside him, ears flat, tail low. A nurse stepped forward, blocking Carl's path as the doctors worked. "Sweetheart, you need to step outside." "No," Carl choked out. He shook his head violently, refusing. His mother was right there, but he couldn't reach her, couldn't help her. Tears burned behind his eyes as his chest tightened with something raw and suffocating. A hand rested firmly on his shoulder. Carl flinched, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But then, Benjamin knelt in front of him. His gaze was steady, anchoring, his grip firm but not forceful. "Carl, look at me." Carl's head snapped up, but his body still trembled. Benjamin didn't move. "Your mum is strong," he said evenly, as if willing the words into existence. "She will fight through this." Carl sucked in a shaky breath. He wanted to believe him. But what if he was wrong? Benjamin gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone." Carl swallowed hard. His fingers curled into Max's fur, gripping tightly as the doctors wheeled Lauren toward the ICU. And then, she was gone. The door shut behind them, leaving Carl standing in the empty space where his mother had been. Benjamin made his decision. As soon as Carl was safely seated in the waiting room, his hands still buried in Max's fur, Benjamin pulled out his phone. He didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about justice. By the time he stepped outside into the cold evening air, his mind was already working through the next steps. Arthur had been murdered by negligence, and someone needed to answer for it. For the next 3 days, Benjamin worked relentlessly. He called in favors. He dug through records. He met with old contacts in law enforcement, some reluctant, some willing, all aware that his influence reached further than they were comfortable admitting. He tracked down former workers from the construction site, men who had been paid off, silenced, or simply too afraid to speak. Some refused to talk, but some agreed. The stories aligned: unsafe working conditions, corners cut, a rushed deadline that led to an accident no one wanted to admit, and at the center of it all, a powerful corporation with too much to lose. Benjamin's legal team assembled the pieces: financial records, backdated reports, internal emails that contradicted the official statements, proof that the company had not only covered up Arthur's death, but had done it before. It was a pattern, and Benjamin was going to burn it to the ground. Meanwhile, Carl refused to leave Lauren's bedside. She had survived surgery, but her body was weak, fragile. The doctors had warned him. "It will take time. She's not out of the woods yet." Carl didn't care. Every morning, he curled up in the chair beside her bed, telling her about Max, about school, about the shelter dogs. Even when she couldn't respond, he kept talking, just in case she could hear him. On the 4th day, Benjamin walked into the hospital with a folder tucked beneath his arm. He had everything he needed. It was time to make someone pay. The days blurred together in a haze of waiting, whispered conversations, and the sterile hum of hospital machinery. Lauren remained unconscious for the first day after her emergency surgery. Carl didn't leave her side. He curled up in the uncomfortable hospital chair, Max's warm body pressed against his legs. He spoke to her softly, about the dogs at the shelter, about school, about anything that came to mind, anything to keep her here. Benjamin kept his distance, but never left. He worked from the hospital lounge, taking calls, meeting with lawyers, ensuring that every loose thread was pulled tight. Every day, he brought food for Carl. Some days, the boy ate. Most days, he didn't. Then, on the 3rd day, Lauren woke up. It was slow at first, a flutter of her eyelashes, a barely audible breath. Then her fingers twitched against the blanket, and when Carl whispered, "Mum," her eyes finally opened. The relief hit so fast and so hard that Carl burst into tears. Lauren was weak, but she was here. And then, that same evening, Benjamin returned with the news. It was over. The company had been exposed. Executives had stepped down. Criminal investigations had begun. The courts had ruled in favor of compensation for Lauren and Carl. Arthur's name had been cleared. Carl listened, his fingers tightening around his mother's frail hand. Lauren's eyes were damp, her lips slightly parted in stunned disbelief. Benjamin set the folder on the hospital table. "The settlement will be transferred to your account by the end of the week." His voice was even, but there was an unmistakable finality in it. It was done. Lauren exhaled shakily. She looked down at the stack of legal documents and financial settlements, cold, printed proof that justice had been served. But justice, no matter how right, couldn't bring back Arthur. Benjamin knew this. Carl knew this. Lauren knew this. And for a long time the room was silent. Carl was the first to speak. "So, what now?" Lauren's fingers brushed across the folder, lingering on the edges of the pages. Then, slowly, a decision formed. "We move forward," she whispered. Carl turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" Lauren met Benjamin's gaze, her voice clearer now, steadier. "I'm not leaving everything behind. I don't want to run. I want to rebuild." Carl blinked. "Rebuild? How?" Lauren exhaled slowly, then smiled. "I'm opening a restaurant." The small storefront stood on a quiet corner near the heart of town. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't grand. But when Lauren first stepped inside, she knew. It felt right. With the settlement money, she bought the place. She renovated it carefully. Not extravagant, just warm. A space where people could gather, where food felt like home. Carl helped, learning how to cook alongside his mother. He spent his afternoons after school wiping down tables, helping in the kitchen, greeting regular customers. He smiled more. Max, naturally, became the unofficial guardian of the restaurant. Every customer was greeted with a wagging tail and bright eyes. And Benjamin, he stayed. Not in the loud, overbearing way of a man who had forced his way into their lives, but quietly, steadily. He visited often, usually under the excuse of checking on business permits or tax filings. But Lauren saw through it. One evening, as she wiped down the counter, she glanced toward Benjamin, sitting at his usual spot near the window, a cup of coffee in hand. "You don't have to keep pretending you have business to check up on," she said dryly. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Maybe I like the coffee." Lauren smirked. "You don't drink sugar." Benjamin exhaled a small chuckle, setting down his cup. His gaze drifted toward Carl, laughing at the register while Max dozed at his feet. "Maybe I just like being here." Lauren's hands stilled on the counter. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and then, quietly, she smiled. Benjamin had found something in this family, something he never knew he needed. And he wasn't going anywhere. The scent of warm spices and freshly baked bread lingered in the air as Benjamin stepped through the door of Lauren's restaurant. It had been several months since the grand opening, and already the place had found its rhythm. The soft hum of conversation filled the cozy space. Neighbors, families, and passers-by drawn in by the inviting glow of the lights and the smell of home-cooked meals. Benjamin shrugged off his coat, hanging it near the door. From behind the counter, Lauren noticed him immediately. Max did too. The retriever lifted his head from where he had been napping near the entrance. The second his eyes landed on Benjamin, his tail thumped excitedly against the wooden floor. Benjamin crouched, scratching behind Max's ears as the dog leaned into the touch. "Still keeping an eye on things, huh?" Lauren, drying her hands on a dish towel, smirked. "He takes his job very seriously." Benjamin straightened. "So do you, from what I hear." Lauren raised an eyebrow. "And who exactly has been reporting on me?" Benjamin tilted his head toward the laughing boy behind the register. Carl was in the middle of handing change to a customer, his movements smooth, practiced. He had grown comfortable in the space, moving through the restaurant with the kind of confidence Benjamin hadn't seen in him before. Lauren followed Benjamin's gaze, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, softly, she smiled. "Table near the window?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Benjamin nodded. He slid into his usual seat, watching the restaurant move around him. A woman balanced plates of steaming food as she made her way to a waiting table. A group of teenagers huddled together in a corner booth, laughing between bites of their meals. A young father helped his daughter cut into her pancakes. There was life here. Warm, steady, earned life. And for the first time in a long time, Benjamin realized he belonged here too. After dinner, Benjamin found Carl waiting near the door, tugging on his jacket. "Park?" the boy asked, looking up expectantly. Benjamin exhaled a quiet laugh. "You never get tired of it, do you?" Carl grinned. Nope. Max barked once, as if seconding the idea. Lauren, wiping down the counter, glanced up. Don't let him talk you into getting another dog. Benjamin smirked. No promises. Carl laughed, already leading the way outside. The park was quiet at this hour, bathed in the soft hues of twilight. Carl ran ahead, Max bounding after him, his tail wagging wildly as Carl tossed a ball into the open field. The retriever darted after it, disappearing into the fading light. Benjamin watched from a distance, his hands in his coat pockets. Lauren stood beside him, arms crossed, the cool evening breeze brushing against her sleeves. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply watched as Carl laughed. Really laughed, as Max chased after the ball, as the weight of the past seemed for a moment like something that could be left behind. Lauren exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. He's happy. Benjamin nodded. He deserves to be. Lauren turned to him then, studying his expression. She saw the way he watched Carl, the careful protectiveness, the unspoken care, the way he fit into their lives, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And suddenly she understood. She didn't need to say it, neither did he. This was home. Carl's laughter rang through the air as Max came bounding back, dropping the ball at his feet before nuzzling against his side. Lauren smiled. Benjamin did too. And as the last light of day faded from, "If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.